Welcome to This Day in His Story, created by American Heritage Worldwide. A reminder that every day holds something new to learn. Did you know that many people consider Independence Hall the birthplace of America because it was here that delegates from 12 of the 13 states met in 1787 to create the United States Constitution. Learn how the Constitutional Convention took place just a few years after the end of the Revolutionary War and created a stronger federal government while still protecting the powers of the states.
Imagine you are standing on a dusty street corner, right in the early 1800s. You are looking up at this dilapidated brick building. The paint is peeling, the structure is heavily neglected, and local developers are actually drawing up a real estate scheme to to bulldoze the entire block.
Right. Yeah.
And you probably think nothing of it, just another old building making way for progress in a growing city. But the wrecking ball in the scenario was swinging directly toward the birthplace of American liberty.
It is. It's just a staggering image to consider. You are looking at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, mere decades after it served as the crucible for the creation of the United States.
Yeah.
And it was almost entirely erased from the map for, like, a real estate flip.
Wow. Yeah. So we are jumping into a really fascinating stack of historical sources today. And our mission for this deep dive is to explore Independence Hall, the drafting of the U.S. Constitution, and exactly why this incredibly fragile framework of government is revered today, not just as a political triumph, but as a literal miracle.
Exactly. And to understand the physical building, we really have to understand the pressure cooker environment that occurred inside it. The stakes, they literally could not have been higher.
Okay, let's unpack this.
So it's the summer of 1787. You have 55 delegates gathering at the Pennsylvania State House, what we now know as Independence Hall. And they represent every state in the Union except for Rhode Island.
Right. Rhode Island didn't show up.
Yeah, they opted out. But the rest of them, they aren't there for some polite, theoretical debate about political science. They are gathered to save a rapidly failing nation.
Right, because to understand the monumental task at the convention, we first have to understand the absolute crisis that came right before it. The timeline here is just wild.
It really is.
Because they didn't just show up to write the Constitution out of nowhere. It was basically an emergency intervention based on the absolute disaster of their first attempt at a government, the Articles of Confederation.
Right, the Articles were ratified back in 1781. And to put that in perspective, that is a full 6 years before the British even surrendered at Yorktown.
Wait, really? 6 years?
Yeah.
So they were trying to write the permanent rules for a country that hadn't even finished fighting its war for independence yet? I mean, that seems like a recipe for a very rushed, very paranoid system of government.
Paranoia is the absolute key word there.
Huh.
Under the Articles, the founders created a very loose confederation of states. Congress was nominally the central authority, but it was designed to have severely limited powers.
Because they were scared.
Exactly. They were terrified of replacing a British tyrant with an American one, so they swung the pendulum incredibly far in the opposite direction.
But how did that actually look in practice? Like, why was it failing so spectacularly by 1786?
Well, because the central government was practically powerless. I mean, they couldn't levy taxes, they couldn't draft soldiers to create a standing army, and they couldn't effectively regulate interstate commerce.
So they had no money and no defense.
Right. It was essentially a government that had to politely ask the states for money and cooperation. And the states frequently just said no.
Wow.
So by 1786, the consequences of that overcorrection were terrifyingly apparent. The Union was on the brink of completely breaking apart. It was universally clear that if the Articles of Confederation weren't immediately amended, the United States of America was going to be a very short-lived experiment.
Which brings us back to that room in Philadelphia in 1787. Initially, the delegates arrived with a very specific, very limited mandate. Just fix the articles, patch them all.
Repair job.
Exactly. But what they actually do is entirely different. It's like taking your car in for a simple oil change, and the mechanic decides to completely scrap the vehicle, melt down the metal, and build a brand new, vastly superior engine from scratch without even telling you.
That is a great way to look at it.
Right. Because they didn't just fix the government. They drafted the United States Constitution.
And if we push that engine analogy further, you can't just scrap a customer's car and expect them to accept it unless the head mechanic is someone with unquestionable universal trust.
Oh, totally.
The delegates realized immediately that to pull off something this audacious, just scrap the existing government entirely, they needed unimpeachable leadership to legitimize the convention.
And that means they needed George Washington.
Yes. They knew they had to elect the great Revolutionary War hero to serve as the convention's president. Without his steady hand and immense national popularity presiding over the room, well, the American public never would have accepted that drastic pivot from a simple amendment process to a whole new government structure.
So to build this massive new engine of government, these delegates needed a secure workshop. And the physical space where they hammered this out, the Pennsylvania State House, has a history that is just as compelling and, honestly, nearly as chaotic as the Constitution itself.
It really does. Independence Hall is a brilliant example of Georgian architecture. Its construction began in 1732 under the oversight of Andrew Hamilton.
The Speaker of the Assembly, right?
Exactly. He was the Speaker at the time. And the original intent for the building was to house all three branches of Pennsylvania's colonial government under one roof. But the construction was an incredibly slow process.
How slow are we talking?
It wasn't fully completed until 1748.
16 years. 16 years to finish one building. I suppose government construction projects running behind schedule is a tradition older than the country itself.
Pretty much, yeah.
But obviously, its destiny was much larger than just Pennsylvania's colonial government. The legislature actually loaned out the use of their famous assembly room for the meetings of the Second Continental Congress, which means this same structure was the site of the drafting of the Declaration of Independence, the signing of those disastrous Articles of Confederation, and now the drafting of the Constitution.
It is undeniably the defining room of the American founding. But what I find fascinating in our source material are the architectural quirks of the building itself.
Oh, the clocks.
Yes. The structure evolved in this very piecemeal, almost chaotic way over the centuries, much like the nation.
Yeah, the clocks are the best example of this chaos. Because digging into the historical notes from our sources, the building's relationship with timekeeping is genuinely hilarious. The texts mention that the first clock on the structure was a massive 40-foot-tall grandfather clock placed on the west end of the building, carved by Samuel Harding.
Right, the Samuel Harding clock.
But then the notes introduced this amazing historical paradox regarding a man named Thomas Stretch.
Ah, yes. The timeline of the Thomas Stretch clock is, it's a bit of a headache.
A headache is putting it mildly, because the text explicitly says this grandfather clock was added in 1853 by Thomas Stretch. But literally the very next sentence says, and I quote, "The giant clock was removed in 1830.
It makes no sense.
No. So Thomas Stretch apparently installed a clock 23 years after it was already removed. The sources actually printed this time-bending contradiction.
It really highlights how messy historical record-keeping can be, especially for a building that underwent so many disjointed renovations.
Well, my favorite part is that the source notes it took the state of Pennsylvania 6 whole years to pay Thomas Stretch a single dime for his work.
6 years?
Right. I mean, if the man was traversing the space-time continuum to install a clock before it was removed, you'd think they could at least cut him a check on time.
You would think so. A replica of the grandfather clock was eventually installed much later, in the summer of 1973, to finally settle the layout. But the tower's relationship with time is a running theme.
Tell me about the steeple.
So the original steeple clock was wooden, and it was actually demolished in 1781. The building sat without an elaborate steeple until 1828, when an architect named William Strickland designed a new one.
But why 1828? Like, what changed that made them suddenly care about putting a massive clock on the top of the building again?
It was a reflection of the era. The decision to prominently include a clock in that 1828 profile was very deliberate. By the 1820s, the Industrial Revolution was beginning to take hold.
Ah, okay. Factory times.
Exactly. As the sources point out, time ruled the structure of people's lives in a way it simply hadn't a century earlier. The building evolved from a purely political space into a functional instrument for a changing society.
That makes total sense. And we can't talk about that brick tower without mentioning the Liberty Bell. Our sources note it was lowered into the highest chamber of that tower in 1781, and it stayed up there until the 1850s.
Right, so it was up there during the convention.
Yeah. It was physically hanging over the delegates while the Constitution was being drafted in 1787. Yet, despite all of this, the Declaration, the Constitution, the Liberty Bell hanging in the tower, the State House was not always treated as hallowed ground.
Which brings us back to the image you started with. By 1816, the building was in a severe state of neglect. A real estate scheme was set in motion to completely demolish Independence Hall and redevelop the block.
It's just wild to think about.
It is. But memory is incredibly fragile, especially in a young nation focused on westward expansion and rapid economic growth. The city of Philadelphia literally had to purchase the entire block in 1816 just to stop the demolition.
They bought it just to keep the wrecking ball away. But it still sat there rotting. It feels insane today to think people would just walk past the birthplace of the country and view it as a tear-down property.
Yeah, it took an outside perspective to really wake the country up to what they were losing. In 1824, Marquis de Lafayette, the French aristocrat, who had served valiantly as a young soldier under George Washington during the Revolution, he returned to America for a grand tour.
I can only imagine what it must have been like for him, walking into that building where he and Washington and the founders had spent so much time only to find it falling apart.
The sources tell us he was visibly disappointed. His remembrance of what that building meant contrasted with a neglected, rundown state house he saw before him. It served as a profound wake-up call.
Like a guilt trip for the whole city.
Exactly. The visible disappointment of an old war hero effectively shamed the local government into action. It sparked a genuine interest in finally restoring the building to its former dignity.
Lafayette's disappointment over the physical decay of the building perfectly mirrors the decay of the nation that brought those delegates into that exact same room back in 1787. Just as the building barely survived demolition, the negotiations happening inside that assembly room were constantly on the verge of total collapse.
Oh, absolutely. The creation of the Constitution was anything but smooth. The delegates engaged in a grueling 3-month debate to devise what would become the federal system.
3 months locked in that room.
In the sweltering heat, they were trying to thread an impossible needle. They needed to construct an intricate system of checks and balances that would prevent a central tyrant while giving the government enough teeth to actually function, which, as we discussed, the Articles of Confederation completely failed to do.
And the single biggest hurdle, the issue that almost blew up the entire convention, was state representation in Congress. I always think of this like a massive roommate dispute or maybe a corporate merger between a massive global conglomerate and a tiny local mom-and-pop shop.
That's a good way to frame it.
Right. The highly populated states, the massive conglomerates, were saying, we bring way more people and resources to the table, so we should get proportional representation in the House rules. More people equals more votes.
But the smaller states, the mom-and-pop shops, in your analogy, they were demanding entirely equal representation, regardless of size. They knew that if it was purely proportional, they would just get steamrolled on every single decision. It was an existential threat to their sovereignty.
How did they actually solve it? Because neither side was willing to budge even an inch.
They solved it through what we now call the Great Compromise. They basically split the difference by creating a bicameral legislature, a Congress with 2 houses.
Okay, the House and the Senate.
Exactly. In the House of Representatives, the heavily populated states got their wish. Representation would be proportional based on population. But in the Senate, the smaller states got their protection. Every state, no matter how large or small, would get exactly 2 equal votes.
It's a brilliant mechanical fix to a deeply philosophical problem. But even with that compromise, the room was incredibly divided, wasn't it?
Very divided.
Because when the document was finally ready on September 17, 1787, George Washington was the very first to sign it. But out of the 55 delegates who originally gathered, only 39 actually put their names on the final Constitution.
Yeah, it was a deeply fractured consensus. Some delegates had gotten so frustrated with the concessions that they just packed up and went home early.
They just quit.
They quit. And 3 delegates who were present at the very end outright refused to give their approval. They believed the document still gave the central government far too much power. And even with those 39 signatures, the work was only just beginning. For the Constitution to actually become law, it still had to be ratified by 9 of the 13 states.
The fact that they got a workable document out of that room at all is astonishing. And George Washington clearly felt the same way. The sources include his own verdict on the process.
Yes, his words are very telling.
He described the fact that Congress had accomplished this drafting in just 4 short months as, and I quote, something a little short of a miracle.
And Washington wasn't one to use hyperbole lightly. He watched these men scream at each other, threaten to walk out, and stubbornly protect their own regional interests in that awful summer heat.
It's just brutal conditions.
To witness them forge a workable compromise out of that level of chaos, well, it felt genuinely miraculous to the person presiding over it.
And that word miracle, it takes on a much heavier weight as we move forward in history, because both the physical location of Independence Hall and the text of the Constitution eventually achieved this revered, almost sacred status in American culture.
You can really see the physical reverence in how Independence Hall was utilized during times of national grief. For example, following President Abraham Lincoln's assassination, his body was brought to Independence Hall.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yes, it was laid in state there for 2 days. And in just those 2 short days, more than 85,000 people filed through the building to pay their respects.
85,000 people.
It had transformed from a neglected brick structure into the hallowed ground of the American soul.
So what does this all mean? Because our sources today push that concept of reverence even further, moving from the physical building to the spiritual weight of the document itself. We have a source in our stack today from Ezra Taft Benson, who was the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 1986.
Right, the Benson quote.
And his perspective shifts this entirely away from political science and into literal theology. Because the truth established in this source is that the drafting of the Constitution wasn't merely a political achievement, it was a divine orchestration.
Yes, the source text asserts as fact that the Constitution itself is a sacred document, and that its words are akin to the revelations of God.
It's such a fascinating reality to look at. Benson establishes the fact that God placed his actual stamp of approval on the Constitution, and that the delegates in that room were, in his words, choicest spirits, sent specifically by the God of heaven to lay the foundation of this government.
It completely reframes how you view those 55 men sweating in the Philadelphia summer heat.
Totally. In this view, which the source presents as absolute truth, they weren't just politicians making gritty concessions, they were actively carrying out a divine mandate.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, what's particularly striking about this source is how it brings the listener directly into that theological mandate. Benson's message doesn't stop in 1787.
Right.
The text asserts that God has sent other choice spirits, including you, the person listening to this right now, to preserve it.
So if you accept this truth laid out in the source, it presents a really heavy personal responsibility. The source material asks a very direct question of you, the audience. In what ways do you reverence and help to preserve the Constitution?
It challenges you to consider your own role. Do you have a personal responsibility to share your support and loyalty to the Constitution with others? The factual argument here is that if a foundation is sacred, and it was laid by choice spirits, its preservation requires active, loyal participation from the choice spirits living today.
Man, what an incredible journey we've explored today through these sources. We started with a weak, failing union that couldn't even tax its own citizens under the Articles of Confederation.
A complete disaster.
Then we walked into a neglected brick building that was literally on the brink of being demolished for a real estate flip. We watched 55 delegates navigate a grueling 3-month debate over state representation that nearly tore the entire convention apart.
Almost didn't happen.
And out of all that chaos, dysfunction, and near disaster, they birthed a framework for liberty that George Washington called a miracle, and that leaders like Ezra Taft Benson confirm bears the literal stamp of God's approval.
The overarching takeaway from these sources is that the most enduring foundations are often built in the most fragile, precarious circumstances. The historical records and, the hilarious timeline paradoxes of the building's own clocks, they remind us that progress is rarely a straight line.
As we wrap up today's deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over, building on that reality of divine revelation we just discussed. We know how heated and difficult those 4 months of compromise were. The delegates were fighting tooth and nail over every word, every comma, every regional concession.
Blood, sweat, and tears.
But imagine for a second, wait, scratch that. Just imagine, what if those 55 delegates somehow knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that their heated compromises would one day be revered as literal divine revelation?
Oh, that's a wild thought.
How might that have changed the way they debated? Would the immense crushing weight of eternity have paralyzed them from making the necessary gritty compromises? Or, believing they were doing the undeniable work of heaven, would it have emboldened them to push even further?
That is a phenomenal question to leave on. History looks very different depending on whether you view it as a chaotic accident or a destined design. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the sources, the building, and the miracle of compromise.
Keep asking questions, keep exploring the history behind the foundations, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.
Thank you for joining us for this day in His story. May the lessons of yesterday inspire you to see God's hand today and to play your part in His story now. For more faith-based learning, visit ahsworldwide.org, the homeschool for faith and family.